Today is May 16th, 2008. My name is Rosalind Benjet. We're here for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society to record the oral history of Joy Mankoff today. And our videographer is Ruth Andrus. Joy,
Yes.
Tell me about your family.
Well, I'm from West Hartford, Connecticut, and I had a very wonderful family, a very active mother and father. My mother was kind of the quintessential volunteer, and I learned from her about what one does in life or what one ought to do. She was very active in her federation and the opera, and she was president of the Brandeis Women's Group in Hartford and president of the Mount Sinai Women's Auxiliary. So a very active volunteer, but I learned from her about helping other people, not just from her volunteer activities, but one of my favorite memories of her was driving down a busy street, and she was driving. I was much too young at the time to drive, and she saw a blind person trying to cross the street, and nobody was helping this man. And my mother stopped the car practically in the middle of the street, didn't say a word to me, just got out and helped him across the street, excuse me, got back into the car and was huffing and puffing because nobody was helping him. And that was that, you know, we drove off. And that was kind of my mother. My father, a very gentle, sweet man, kind of the peacemaker of the family. And he used to describe gentlemen friends as a prince of a fellow. And really that's what my father was. He was a prince of a fellow. He was very, as I say, sweet and gentle, but firm when he needed to be. He also served on the Federation, and they were both active in the on the opera board, the Connecticut Opera Board.
Mm-hmm. And were your parents also born in Connecticut?
My mother was born in New York City, but moved to Hartford when she was 1 or 1.5, and my father was born in Hartford. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And what did your father do for a living when you were a child?
He had a truck distributorship.
Mm-hmm.
He sold federal trucks, which are no more, and was busy with that.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of activities did you have as a child?
Oh, gosh. Well, I think normal, you know, kid stuff. Went to Sunday school and sneaked out of Sunday school. We used to go on Saturday, and honestly, I feel terrible now, but my father would drive us, and it was from West Hartford to Hartford, and it took 15 or 20 minutes to drive us, and I'd get there, and occasionally my girlfriends and I would sneak out and go to a movie. Mm-hmm. And not exactly a good thing to do, but I still won candlesticks when I was in 4th grade for best improvement in Hebrew. Not the best Hebrew, but just the best improvement. But as I say, I think it was a very normal childhood, you know, riding bikes. I have an older brother, he's 2 years older, and I wanted to do everything he did, of course. So, you know, I played baseball, tried to play basketball, and that wasn't very successful. But just had a very, we did a lot of day camping trips. I mean, not camping, but we would go to national forests and cook out. And that was really a big part of my summer memories, and or spring or fall. Whenever the weather was right, my father would get some great big steaks, and when people ate all that stuff, and we would go drive, whether it was half an hour away or an hour away, and he would set up. He always had a portable barbecue, and we didn't use the big ones in the park. That was too hard. But you know, they'd have their steak and their chicken and whatever, and we would have picnics, and it was kind of a typical New England upbringing, and a very happy childhood.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about your experiences in school. Where did you go to school, and what were your interests at that time?
I went to grammar school in West Hartford, of course, and I went through public school, which is a very good, they have a very good school district in Hartford, or at least did when I went to school. I was a good student. I was a very good math student, and went on to, we had a separate junior high, 7th through 9th grade, and then high school was 10th through 12th grade. And I don't remember studying very hard, but I did study, and did well in school, and went on to Connecticut College, and that too was, the whole education, I think, was pretty normal.
Mm-hmm. And what did you major in at school?
I majored in sociology, which shortly after was not particularly thrilled about having chosen, because I really didn't want to be a social worker at the time. And at the time, I felt that there were very limited possibilities for women. I could be a teacher, I could be a nurse, or I could be a social worker, or I could be a flight attendant. And I really wasn't going to do any of those things, so I did take sociology. And at first, I used to say I never did anything with it, but I really have. In my volunteer life, I remember taking a course in crime in college. And much later, I was on the Citizens Police Relations Board. And after that, I remember also doing a paper, a research paper for Annette Strauss when she was running for mayor on crime. So I guess I did get to use some of my my sociology that I majored in college.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of Jewish activities did you mentioned that your parents were involved in some Jewish organizations. How did your family celebrate Jewish holidays?
Rather traditionally, when my grandparents were alive, I remember wonderful seders at their home. My grandfather was a caterer, and my mother liked to say that he was the state's leading caterer, and he did do wonderful things. He did catering for the governor's ball with 5,000 people, and just a wonderful recollection for the whole family. But we would have dinners at my grandparents' house, always with a kids' table. which I just loved. I had lots of cousins, and my mother had five sisters and one brother. So there were lots of kids to celebrate with, and a very close family until they passed away. And then we kind of all went our different ways, which was rather sad, but part of life, I guess.
Yeah. What interactions did your family have then with the Jewish community in Hartford?
Well, through their synagogue, and they were active in their synagogue's activities, whatever they were.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, my parents met at high holidays when my father was returning to Hartford from his stint of running the family business for 10 years in New Haven, Connecticut. And he saw my mother, who was attempting to look older. She was 10 or 12 years younger than he. And she had her lorgnettes, and as I say, was attempting to look older. But anyway, they married, they met in the synagogue and were married by Rabbi Morris Silverman, whose son later served Congregation Shereth Israel, and whose book is still actively used.
That Silverman.
That Silverman.
Yes.
He confirmed my mother. He married my parents. He certainly confirmed me and my brother. And he married Ron and me. And so there's a very strong Silverman connection. As a matter of fact, I think his son still has a congregation in California, and I haven't contacted him, but I did see him when we were out there once. I did see a picture of him in the Jewish paper out there.
What did you do after college?
Oh, I went, first of all, with my wonderful liberal arts education. I wanted to get a job somewhere, but I had no specialty, really, not wanting to do the things I've mentioned before. So I took speed writing, and then went to New York and got a job at CBS as a secretary, and did that for 2.5 years, and didn't really consider moving in to have a career in that field. It was a fun thing to do, and I read a lot of books when I should have been doing something more, but I was there, as I say, for 2.5 years, and Ron came to town, and so our engagement was a good opportunity to leave and move on.
How did you meet?
Well, how long do we have for this? Ron and I met when I was a junior in college. I somehow got it into my head that I wanted to go to Puerto Rico and St. Thomas. I have no idea why. And I couldn't get any of my girlfriends to go, so I got my parents to go. And when we got to St. Thomas, a social hostess introduced me and my family to Ron, and that was in 1955. So we were both smitten right away with each other. And we had 5 days there with my parents. And then we wrote, when I went back to school, that was spring vacation of my junior year. And we wrote each other. and then he came to pick me up to go home for the summer. He was stationed in, I've forgotten, I don't know, Georgia, South Carolina, someplace. And he got himself transferred to Newport, Rhode Island, so that he could be nearer. And anyway, I remember him picking me up at school, and everyone was all aflutter because they had heard so much about him. But we dated for a year, not exclusively, but we did date for a year. And then he wanted to get married, and I wasn't ready for that. And so that was at the end of my senior year. We broke up. And he finished in the Navy, and I went to secretarial school and moved to New York. When he was finished in the Navy, he went back to Minneapolis. But little did I know that when he was still in the Navy, he had been fixed up by a friend of mine in New York. And I went, when I was looking for a job, I went to New York and stayed with that friend. He called her to ask her for a date. She was off at work, and I answered the phone. And so that's how he knew where to find me. There wasn't any Googling in those days. And so he wrote me at the end of that summer, wrote and sent the letter to the Barbizon for Women, which is where I had stayed for several months. And believe it or not, the letter was forwarded to the correct sublet that I was in for the summer only. And I figured that was fate. So we wrote that whole year, and he decided to get his master's in taxation as long as I was in New York. So we went together for a year, didn't see each other for 2 years, but we wrote during that second year. And then he came to New York and got his master's in taxation. And we were married at the end of that year. So it took 4 years before we were married.
And where did you live after you got married?
We came directly to Dallas. He had an aunt and uncle here, Emma Sue and Jerry Frank. Jerry Frank was his mother's brother, and he had been here several times to see them, and just always wanted to move to Dallas. So that's what I'm doing in Dallas, Texas.
Where did you live when you first moved to Dallas?
We lived in an apartment on Frederick Square, a furnished apartment, very little, but it was, as I say, furnished. And Emma Sue and Jerry came to pick us up at the airport and brought us back to the apartment, which they had put their touches in. They had hung some of their pictures, put little, at the time people smoked, ashtrays and cigarette holders and plants on tables. And it was so lived in looking. It was just a wonderful thing to come home to right after our honeymoon. It was very wonderful. She even had cooked dinner.
And what did you do when you got here?
Well, initially settled in. Ron took his Texas bar, and Emma Sue and Jerry gave a party for us when we first moved here. They invited 135 people between the ages of 20 and 40. So the people who had been included would call us and invite us to go to the movies or play bridge or something. It was a wonderful introduction, and there were a couple of good friends who would call and say, well, Doris Bugner was one. Can you shut that off for a second? Isn't that bizarre?
So you met lots of people immediately.
Yes, yes. And at some point, my mother had said, you know, if you want to volunteer, sometimes you just have to pick up the phone and call someone. So I picked up the phone and I called the opera. And I said, here I am, I'd like to volunteer. And they said, oh my goodness, this is most unusual. Thank you very much, we'll get back to you. And they never did, which was not a good thing. I remember telling Noopy Jaffe that, Marie Jaffe, and she said, oh honey, don't you know you have to pay to be in the opera, or a member of their, I didn't ask to be a member of their board, I just thought I would volunteer in some way. In any event, I did not know at the time that that's what one did with the opera. So Emma Sue decided that I absolutely had to join National Council of Jewish Women, and I did. And the first thing I did with them, I think, was bake cookies for their meeting, and became very active in that, and went on to do, was active in Brandeis at the time, and it just led to lots of other things. NCJW has been my main activity throughout my adult life, really because they train their members to go out into the community and participate. And so I started representing them in certain particular organizations. And then, for instance, they asked me to represent them at the Dallas Area Agency on Aging in their, that's what it was. It was called the Area Agency on Aging, and it was through the Community Council of Greater Dallas. So I represented them, but then I ended up chairing the Area Agency on Aging. And, well, there were lots of things like that. I remember representing them at oh dear, what was it? It had to do with the jails. It was, you know what, let's, I can't come up with it, so can you cut that?
We can.
Okay, thank you.
What were your impressions of Dallas when you first moved here?
Oh my, I thought it was hot.
You were right.
My first trip here was at the end of August, and Ron had a car that was a convertible, and it didn't have a lot of air conditioning, and I just remember getting off the plane, and poor thing, he met me with some wilted roses, and then we got into his car, and it just was really, really hot. And well, it cooled off. I mean, you know, what impressed me most about Dallas was that the people were so warm, and that it wasn't superficial and it wasn't short-lived. They meant it. They were so hospitable and so welcoming. And the people I met initially are my good friends now, many of them. And Dallas has been wonderful for us. It has been a wonderful community to raise children in and to be a part of. And that's so important.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about your children. When were they born?
Jeff was born May 19th, 1961. And he lives here with my two perfect grandchildren, Bradley and Michelle, and their wonderful mom, Stacy. And they are my joy, of course. And Doug was born in June of '63, and he, well, fortunately for him, unfortunately for us, lives in Los Angeles with his with my three perfect grandchildren, and Marcia, their wonderful mother, and fortunately we get to see them a lot in the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And the brothers are quite close and quite determined that their children grow up with close cousins, so they make an effort to do that, and it's really wonderful.
Well, what was the city like then when your children were growing up?
Oh, it was a lot simpler and a lot safer and a lot slower. I'm still, everywhere I go, I still think it's going to take 10 minutes to get wherever I'm going, and it doesn't. The traffic is so great here now, like it is all over the country. It was a good place to raise children. I must say that the school district was not good at the time compared to what Ron and I were used to. And so we made it a point, even though both of us had grown up in public schools, we sent our children to private schools. They both went to Lamplighter, which was a wonderful, wonderful school where they still say they hug them in and they hug them out. And the children really, really grew and prospered there. They do part Montessori and part whatever is good. They did a wonderful job at the time. And I remember when at one point with Jeff, when they assessed him and said that he was doing very well. And I was trying to relate it to the other children. I was trying to get a sense of how well he was doing, and I worded my questions every way I could to get that information. I even said, well, how well is Jeff doing in comparison to how well the other children are doing? But they wanted me to know that Jeff was doing very well for Jeff, and that was what was important. And I think that's a wonderful philosophy. They both went on to St. Mark's after that and had a wonderful education there.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And did you belong to a synagogue or a temple?
Oh, sure. We right from the beginning belonged to Temple Emmanuel.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron was became president of Temple.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't particularly active there, but I was on the social action committee for a while, and I was on the board for a
Mm-hmm.
term.
And where were you living while the children were growing up?
We lived on Colehurst, which is a block north of Walnut Hill off of Preston Road.
Mm-hmm.
it was a cul-de-sac, so it was very, very safe. The kids could go out and play, and they didn't have very far to go. There was Preston Road on one end, and they knew they couldn't go across that, and then the cul-de-sac, and they couldn't go on to Walnut Hill. So it was a very small, very warm and tight neighborhood. We would have parties in the street and block parties, and everyone looked out for everyone else's children, and it was a very lovely place to raise our children.
Now, you served as president of NCJW.
I did.
Can you tell us about that?
I did. Well, at the time, we had a very long chain of command. I mean, and one worked up. I was vice president initially of, I don't know whether it was public affairs first or, I never did membership, but I can't remember all the vice presidencies that I had, but worked into administrative vice president, which was executive or first vice president, and became president. So, but I had 2 or 3 vice presidencies before that, and chaired, most of the committees, bylaws, and just most of the committees that they had. It was a long commitment and a joyous one. It's still a wonderful organization. I want you to know I had a meeting here yesterday for SHARE, for their endowment fund, and I found that is an organization so beloved by people who are very active in it that when I was president, I occasionally called a past president and said, would you chair X or would you do Y? And the answer I always got was, oh, I'd love to. I haven't done anything for council in a while. I'm so glad you called me. And that's the kind of attitude that it engenders. Mm-hmm. Is that the word? Yeah. It's in any event. Still, always keep in touch and like to know what's going on. My daughter-in-law Stacy is on the board, and so it's a wonderful organization that does wonderful things in the community.
Mm-hmm. What was a favorite project that you worked on?
Oh my goodness. Well, this is a hard one for me. I guess a favorite one was the Fred Douglass, volunteering at the Fred Douglass School. We were the first organization to get into an ISD school to volunteer, because for some odd reason there was a superintendent who was very unwelcoming of volunteers. And finally the tides turned, and I think he perhaps moved on to other places, and we were able to go in and read to the kids and tutor in whatever way we were needed. Other things I enjoyed, we did a study on daycare in Dallas, and that became a very important book for the daycare community. Windows on Daycare, that was in 1972 or something like that. And we did things like a war on poverty. That was a national project which we all participated in locally. Lots of good programs and projects.
And what are you working on now?
Right now, well, right now I'm doing a fun thing, and that is I'm on the opera board. Finally got on the opera board. I've been on it for, I don't know, 8 or 9 years, and I chair the Orpheus Legacy Society, which is their planned giving, their planned giving program. And but right now I'm serving on the search committee for the new general director, and that's been very interesting and enlightening. The opera community is a very small community, so it's very, very interesting. But I'm also on the board of Friends of WRR, and I belong to the Dallas Summit, which is a women's organization that doesn't do a whole lot, but we educate ourselves and about certain topics, and it's a fun thing for about 100 women to be in. And I'm on the board of the Women's Museum and Institute for the Future. That's been a very exciting thing to do. That meets in Fair Park in a wonderful old building that used to be a cattle auction house by day and an opera house by night. And it was renovated by Wendy, I think her name is Wendy Joseph Evans, or Wendy Evans Joseph. She was a very responsible architect for the Washington Holocaust Museum. Wendy Evans Joseph is her name.
Mm-hmm.
And did a fabulous job there. So my activities are, I'm on the development committee of Planned Parenthood, and keep my finger kind of in the pie in a lot of organizations through email, really. That keeps me advocating and doing all sorts of being informed.
And who are your role models?
My mother. So active in her community. Honestly, it's not a question I had thought about. I'd like to give it some thought and maybe come back to it. Can we do that?
Mm-hmm. Tell us about your family today. What are they doing? Where are they living?
Oh, my family today. Can I fell?
Sure.
They're all active. It's quite wonderful. Jeff is, I'll do it by age, and Jeff is he's very politically active, and active with investments. His business is a computer program that he developed and has a patent on. And I hope that I don't have to explain it here because it's a little over my head. He's coaching his son's baseball team right now, and Stacy, always active. She's been active in the summer musicals for years, and represented. She served on a citywide women's tennis board, and I believe was the first Jewish woman to be on it. And as I told her, was such a wonderful representative. Stacy has a very sweet way, a very engaging smile, and she could tell them that it wasn't right to schedule tournaments on Rosh Hashanah in a way that many people can't. And so she's done that. She's on, I don't know whether I said the council board, and she's on the high board, and very actively involved with her sister who lives at High, and very actively involved with my two perfect grandchildren here. Doug is a movie producer in Los Angeles and has had a string of wonderful successes with a movie that called Sozi. Do you want advertisements in this? I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
Sozi won an Oscar for Best Foreign Film, and you can always. And the very next year had a film called Water, which was nominated for an Oscar. Mm-hmm. And the very next year had a film called Away from Her, and for that, Julie Christie received a Golden Globe Award and was nominated for an Oscar. So he has a very exciting career, and with new movies coming along all the time. And his latest is called Before the Rains. Marcia is very, very, excuse me, I do want to say that I don't think I said that both of the boys are active. Jeff is active politically and also is on the AJC board, and I know has served on the Temple Finance Committee. I'm not sure exactly which one, but excuse me, Doug, serves on a national Jewish camping board, and I believe chairs his federation's industry. The men in the movie industry has a section that he chairs. They both were in a leadership program which is called, what was that? I know Rachel was in it also.
Some man's name.
Yes, it's the owner of, can we stop this for a second?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, so that was, I think Ben was in it.
Both Doug and Marcia were in the Wexner Scholarship Program, a 2-year program for Jewish leaders, and they both have really led in their communities. Marcia just received the Young Women's Leadership Award from her federation, and which we went to see, and that was fun. So they're all active. Marcia's also active in Planned Parenthood, and I know Stacy belongs to that here. And they both have their other interests, not only mine.
How do you think the city has changed since you first came to live in Dallas?
Well, I think it's absolutely exploded. It's, of course, the population has changed, and the look of it has changed. I mean, we have an area, the Performing Arts Center, where there will be, in 2009, buildings by 4 Pritzker Prize-winning architects. Phenomenal. The Victory area is like another city. It's absolutely amazing what has happened to Dallas. Dallas is still filled with very welcoming people, wonderful volunteers, and I've been astonished at the explosion of giving in Dallas. People have become so philanthropic, in addition to the few philanthropists who could always be counted on here. the numbers have spread, have grown, and the reach has spread, and I think it's still a wonderful place to live and work.
Mhm.
It's a wonderful city.
Is there anything that you would like to add?
I didn't do my role models. I don't know who are my role models. I don't know. Beside my mother, I honestly don't know. I mean, I never set out to somebody. I'm glad you didn't say what were my goals, because I never sat down and said I want to reach such and such, or I remember meeting, I think her Liza Solander, I think. And she said I saw her, she was featured in a Sunday section when we had those features, remember? And she said my goal was to become president of every organization in whatever. And so I didn't have those kind of goals. I just, was moved up and became, you mentioned it, I don't know I guess this is Jewish, so, but I was also president of Planned Parenthood and president of the Women's Council of Dallas County and president of the Dallas Summit. And I guess that's all. Oh, and the founding president of the Women's Issues Network. So I'm sorry I didn't say that my issues have been mainly women's issues and Jewish and the environment, and that this isn't rolling now, is it? Oh, you'll have to do some severe editing. But I think maybe we'll stop now.
Thank you very much.
Oh, would you please edit that? I mean, that was really